This is Vietnam, a small country in Southeast Asia that spent most of the 20th century locked in war. From a native people fighting off their imperial masters to a proxy war between two superpowers, all while fighting a bitter civil war, this beautiful country with its lush countryside, deep jungles and beautiful mountains was just not a great place to be for like half a century. This is basic history on the Vietnam War. The start of the Vietnam War can be traced to the arrival of the French. This, like all start points when discussing a historical event, is completely arbitrary. And I could easily start when Vietnam gained independence from China or from the end of World War II, but I chose to start here. And if you don't like it, please stay and watch the rest of the video. And like and subscribe. I'm new. I need this. Anyway, as I was saying, the French moved in by 1887, had taken control of Indochina, modern day Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam. They, as in the French, proceeded to act like all European colonial empires, soaking up the wealth of their colony, destroying native culture and ways of life, and committing the occasional crimes against humanity, just for fun. All this changed in September 1940 with the arrival of the Japanese. They swept through Southeast Asia, booting out all the old colonial empires and setting up a new one. Now, to be clear, this was not a liberation for any of these countries. It was in many ways meet the new boss, same as the old boss. In some ways, it was different. This wasn't the Germans or the British replacing the French, but another Asian people replacing them. With Japan's offensives, they not only gained outstanding military victories, which they certainly did, but they also destroyed the image of European invincibility, that flimsy facade that all these empires relied on. The rebellion and revolt was pointless, as victory is literally impossible. But victory wasn't impossible. In fact, to those watching on as the Japanese rolled up the old colonies like a carpet, it looked very possible indeed. At the end of World War II, and the sudden defeat of the Japanese in 1945, much of Southeast Asia found itself in a power vacuum, with the Japanese leaving and the colonial powers trying, with varying degrees of success, to move back in. Home had international pleas to be recognised as an independent nation, especially to the US, but for various geopolitical reasons, the US declined to get involved and allowed the French to try and reclaim its old colony. Unfortunately for the French, much had changed in the past few years. The people of Vietnam, especially those in the north, were not super keen on bowing down to their old masters. And so began a bloody struggle for independence that would end up claiming some 47,000 French lives and approximately 500,000 Viet Minh. The war quickly settled into a pattern familiar to those of us who grew up on the Iraqi or Afghan wars of the 21st century. The French controlled the major cities, the roads, and all the important infrastructure, with the Viet Minh controlling basically everything else. The French and their local allies never had the power to fully defeat the Viet Minh, while the Viet Minh never could hope to defeat the French in a conventional war. And so both sides entered into a bloody stalemate. Back in France, the people were tiring of this bloody war far away from home, that had no end in sight, and no real gain for them. With both public patience and money running out, the French turned to the US for help, and all hopped up on Cold War fears of communism sweeping the globe and Southeast Asia falling like dominoes. The US began to provide money and military equipment to their French allies, and in short order would be covering 80% of the cost of the war. This was not enough to save the French, who after 8 years of fighting, and after suffering heavy defeats at places like Dien Bien Phu, agreed to leave in 1954. Peace that was signed after this didn't really solve a whole lot. The country was divided into two, with a communist north and a capitalistic south. Both sides wanted to control the other, and in short order, conflict would break out between both sides. The US had been sending military advisors to assist the French, slowly sending more year on year, and this trend continued with the newly independent South Vietnam. The ARVN, the South Vietnamese army, was a corrupt and ineffective force, and despite some great individual soldiers and commanders, was wholly unable to come to grips with their enemy. The North, on the other hand, quickly came under the sway of the Politburo of the Communist Party, who ruthlessly and effectively took power. With supply routes open to both the Soviet Union and China, the North was able to send enough equipment south to equip the new guerrilla group fighting in the south, the Viet Cong. Despite the misgivings of its leaders, all of Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon are recorded as saying they know Vietnam is a quagmire and they didn't see a path to victory. The US continued to increase its amount of personnel and military equipment and slowly got dragged into the fighting more and more until they were doing the brunt of it. The US faced the same problem as the French had before them. They easily controlled all of the cities of the south and the roads and infrastructure in between. But with invasion of the north off the table, for fear of China joining the war a la Korea, and not enough forces or local support to tame the countryside, the war fell back into the same bloody stalemate. The US had much more powerful weapons than the French, but the Viet Cong and their NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, had gained much experience fighting the French, and had an established supply route in the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and safe fallback positions in the north and in Laos and Cambodia. One part of the war that cannot be ignored is the atrocities. Many people have heard of American war crimes such as the My Lai massacre, where American troops entered and destroyed villages of innocent civilians, killing men, women, and children. All sides in this war committed such atrocities: American, South and North Vietnamese, French, and even the Japanese. Vietnam was no stranger to crimes against humanity, and no side can ever claim to be free of guilt. Back in the US, as casualties mounted, evidence of American misconduct came to light, and the lies of successive governments were exposed. Public opinion began to turn against the war. Lyndon B. Johnson, for example, had to call off bombing in the north to soothe public discontent. Nixon was elected on a promise of bringing the war to a swift end, and cities played host to massive rallies, riots, and even battles, as the Vietnam War, along with a whole host of other societal issues, began to divide the nation. When the NVA, North Vietnamese Army, launched the Tet Offensive, a massive offensive across much of the south, even as it failed to take any of its military objectives, and the communist forces took massive casualties and lost incredible amounts of military equipment, it did manage to convince the American public that the war was truly unwinnable, and eventually all sides agreed to peace talks in Paris. These talks led to what looked like on paper a return to the status quo: a communist regime in the north and a capitalistic one in the south. But with the Americans pulling out, when the north came knocking, the whole rotting house that was the South Vietnamese regime came tumbling down, and after 30 odd years, Vietnam was united as one country. Ravaged by war, politically divided, and economically destroyed, but for all that, united and at peace, after facing down both a colonial empire and global superpower, the country was finally free to chart its own path.